I still remember the day it all began. It was a Saturday morning, the sun filtering through my kitchen window as I made my usual cup of coffee. The scent of freshly brewed beans filled the air, and for a moment, life felt blissfully simple. I glanced out the window and smiled at my newly stained wooden fence. It had taken me 2 months of hard work to build it. I had sanded every plank by hand, stained it with rich mahogany tones, and installed each section with care. It wasn't just a fence. It was my labor of love. The privacy it provided was priceless. My yard, once exposed to prying neighbors and constant foot traffic, was now my sanctuary. But the serenity didn't last. A sharp knock at the door interrupted my peaceful morning. I frowned, wiping my hands on a dish towel, and walked over. When I opened the door, Margaret Green, the president of the Bentwood HOA, stood before me. Her sharp eyes immediately fell on my fence. She gave a smug smile, one that made my stomach churn. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said in her usual, condescending tone. "I'm here to inform you that your fence violates HOA regulations." I blinked in disbelief. "Violates?" I asked, confused. "It's just a fence. It's on my property." She reached into her folder of doom, the one every HOA board member seemed to carry, and pulled out a citation notice. "You failed to submit a fence alteration request," she said crisply. "And according to Section 14B of the HOA guidelines, the fence exceeded the allowed height by 3 inches. I stared at the paper. A $1,500 fine was written in bold, red ink. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. "I built that fence with my own hands. It's not bothering anyone." Margaret arched a perfectly sculpted brow. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter. You have 14 days to pay the fine or tear the fence down. If you refuse, we'll file a lien on your property." And just like that, she turned and walked away. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the fine. My hands trembled with frustration. The fence was on my property. It was mine, not the HOA's. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Daniel Carter, my younger brother, who had recently passed the bar. "Dan, I need your help," I said, explaining the situation. He sighed on the other end of the line. "Let me guess, Margaret Green again? You know her?" I asked, surprised. He chuckled darkly. "Yeah, she's been running the Bentwood HOA like her personal kingdom for years. You're not the first person she's fined unfairly." I clenched my jaw. "I'm not backing down." "Good," Daniel said. "Let's fight this." The next morning, I awoke to the sound of my phone vibrating violently against my nightstand. Groggy, I squinted at the screen. It was Daniel. "Hey!" I mumbled, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "You're going to get down here," he said, his voice tense. "What? Why? It's barely 7 a.m. Just get outside. Now." My stomach tightened at the urgency in his voice. Still half asleep, I threw on a t-shirt and jeans, then slipped into my boots. I stepped onto the front porch, my heart instantly sinking. There, parked across the street, were 2 white trucks with the HOA's logo on the side. 3 men in safety vests were standing near my fence, one of them holding a circular saw. Margaret stood by with her arms crossed, watching with a smug smile. "Hey!" I shouted, jogging toward them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the workers, broad-shouldered with thick arms and a buzz cut, glanced at me impassively. "We've been authorized by the HOA to cut down any non-compliant structures." Without another word, he fired up the circular saw. The sharp whine of the blade pierced the air. I lunged toward the fence, shoving the man back. "Touch my fence, and I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Daniel appeared by my side, waving a manila folder in the air. "You'll be facing restraining order and lawsuit if you so much as scratch that wood," he barked. Margaret's smirk faltered. "You can't sue the HOA for enforcing regulations," she sneered. Daniel's lips curved into a wolfish grin. "Actually, we can. This is a cease and desist order. You're now legally prohibited from altering or destroying my client's property until the case is resolved." Margaret's face flushed with anger. She snatched the papers from Daniel's hand, glaring at them. "You're making a huge mistake, Daniel," she hissed, her voice low with menace. No, Margaret, you are. The workers exchanged uncertain glances. One of them muttered, I'm not getting sued for this, and powered off the saw. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she gestured for them to leave. This isn't over, she spat before storming off. That evening, I sat on my porch, staring at my fence. I ran my fingers over the wood grain, tracing the slight imperfections I'd sanded away with care. It wasn't just a fence, it was a symbol of my independence. But Margaret had declared war, and I wasn't about to back down. Daniel sat beside me, tossing a stress ball back and forth in his hands. You know she's going to escalate this, right? He said grimly. Let her try. I muttered, my voice low with defiance. You're ready for this fight? He asked. No, I admitted, but I'm not letting her win. The next morning, I filed an injunction against the HOA. It was meant to prevent them from legally touching my property until the court date. But Margaret wasn't done. That same afternoon, I found a second notice taped to my door. Violation of HOA Code Section 23C, unauthorized landscaping. $2,000 fine. I blinked at the paper. Landscaping. I scoffed aloud. You gotta be kidding me. My front yard was completely standard. A few flower beds, a patch of green grass, and a stone path to the porch. Daniel stood beside me, arms crossed, staring at the notice. She's grasping at straws, he muttered. She's trying to financially suffocate me, I said bitterly. The next day, I received another fine. Unapproved mailbox design, $1,000 fine. Then another, parking violation, $500 fine. And another, failure to maintain lawn height, $750 fine. It was relentless. Margaret was weaponizing the HOA rules against me, hoping to bleed me dry with fines and harassment, but she underestimated me. That night, I sat at my desk, my jaw tight with determination. My hands shook with adrenaline as I sketched a blueprint of my new plan. Margaret wanted to fine me for my fence? Fine. I would build a fence they couldn't tear down. I spent the next 3 weeks tirelessly working. I brought in a structural engineer who helped me design a new barrier, not just any fence. No, this was going to be a fortified wall, one that couldn't be legally destroyed. I sourced heavy-duty steel beams, concrete, and stone. I filed for a permit for a decorative garden enclosure, exploiting a loophole in the HOA's own regulations. The construction crew worked day and night. Neighbors peered over their porches, curious and impressed. The final result was nothing short of magnificent. A 7-foot-tall stone wall reinforced with steel beams stood in place of my old wooden fence. The HOA regulations didn't specify a material limit, only a height restriction. When Margaret drove by and saw it, her face paled. She slammed on her brakes and stared wide-eyed at the massive structure. I walked out onto my porch, coffee in hand, and gave her a mocking wave. She climbed out of her car, her heels clacking furiously against the pavement. Her eyes were wild with disbelief. What is that? She sputtered, pointing at the wall. A fence, I replied coolly. But you can't tear this one down. She stomped toward me, her face red with rage. You think you're so clever, don't you? No, I replied, smirking. I just know how to read the fine print. She was shaking with fury, but she knew she was beat. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm. The stone wall stood defiantly, an unshakable monument of my defiance against the HOA's tyranny. It was perfectly legal, thanks to the loophole I had exploited. The neighbors began to take notice. By the end of the week, several people strolled by, pausing to admire the structure. That's impressive, Mr. Jennings, my next-door neighbor, said as he nodded approvingly. Beautiful work, said Mrs. Grant from 2 houses down. I wish I could build something like that. And that's when it happened. One evening, as I sat on my porch with Daniel, a few neighbors strolled over. The middle-aged couple from across the street, Paul and Maria, approached cautiously. Hey, Carter, Paul called out. Got a minute? I gestured for them to join us. What's up? I asked, sipping my beer. Paul glanced at Maria before speaking. We've been watching how you handle the HOA, he said with a nervous chuckle. Yeah, Margaret's been on our backs too. Maria added, her voice soft. About our flower beds. Apparently, they're 2 inches too wide. I blinked, stunned. You got fined for flower beds? I asked, incredulous. And for leaving our garbage cans out an hour too long, Paul grumbled. Oh, and for painting our shutters the wrong shade of green, Maria muttered with a bitter smile. Daniel exchanged a knowing glance with me. It's not just you, he muttered. One by one, the neighbors began to share their own horror stories. Mrs. Grant had been fined $500 for having a small dog statue in her front garden, labeled as an unapproved lawn ornament. The Wilkersons, a young couple with a toddler, had received a $1,200 fine for a plastic kiddie pool in their backyard. An elderly man named Mr. Thompson, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years, got fined $2,000 for having a flagpole that was too tall. The HOA had turned the neighborhood into a money-making scheme. That night, a dozen neighbors gathered in my backyard, sitting on folding chairs and picnic tables. Daniel stood at the front, holding a whiteboard marker, sketching out a plan of action. This isn't just about the fence anymore, I said, pacing before the group. Margaret is running this HOA like her own personal dictatorship. It's time we fight back. Daniel tapped the board. We need to form a homeowners alliance, he declared. We'll pool our resources, hire legal counsel, and challenge their fines in court. Individually, they can push us around. But if we fight together, they can't win, Paul finished, his voice determined. I scanned the group, faces filled with hope and defiance. Mrs. Grant clenched her hands into fists. I'm in, she said firmly. Me too, Mr. Jennings added. Same here, Maria and Paul chimed. One by one, the neighbors stood up, pledging their support. We were no longer scattered victims. We were united warriors. The next morning, I was woken by pounding at my front door. I opened it to find Margaret standing on my porch, flanked by 2 men in suits. Her face was twisted with smug satisfaction. She handed me a thick envelope. Congratulations, Mr. Carter, she sneered. You're being served. I opened the envelope and scanned the papers. It was a lawsuit. The HOA was suing me for malicious defiance and public slander. I felt the blood drain from my face. You're kidding me, I muttered. You thought you were so clever, building that wall, Margaret hissed. But you've made one mistake. I own this neighborhood. I will bury you in legal fees. You'll lose your house, Carter. I glared at her, my jaw tightening. You're not going to win, I said coldly. Oh, I will, she sneered. I always do. But she underestimated me. Again, the courtroom was packed with neighbors. The entire Homeowners Alliance had shown up, sitting together, their faces stern with determination. Margaret sat at the HOA's table, smirking confidently, while her team of overpriced lawyers prepared their arguments. Daniel stood beside me, calm and collected. You ready? He asked. Let's crush them, I replied. The judge took her seat, and the case began. The HOA's lead attorney approached the bench with an oily smile. Your Honor, the defendant willfully defied multiple HOA regulations and, as a result, caused irreparable damage to the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity. I rolled my eyes. Aesthetic integrity? Really? I whispered to Daniel. When it was our turn, Daniel calmly approached the judge. Your Honor, my client's fence was completely legal. The HOA's lawsuit is nothing more than a vindictive smear campaign, fueled by personal bias. He handed the judge a folder of evidence, photos, documents, and records. Furthermore, we have documented proof that the HOA has been abusing its authority, finding residents for minor, non-violating infractions. The judge narrowed her eyes at Margaret, whose smug expression began to falter. Mr. Carter, the judge asked, turning to me, do you have anything to add? I stood and faced the room. Yes, Your Honor, I do. I turned toward my neighbors, my voice steady but strong. I'm just a man who wanted to build a fence on his own property. The HOA fined me, harassed me, and tried to ruin me. But I'm not alone. They've done the same to everyone here. We are not backing down. I glanced at Margaret, my eyes filled with defiance. We're taking back our neighborhood. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the verdict. In the matter of Carter versus the Bentwood HOA, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Carter. Cheers erupted from the gallery. The neighbors clapped and hugged one another. Margaret's face turned ashen. She sat in stunned silence as the judge continued. The Bentwood HOA is ordered to pay damages for harassment, legal fees, and wrongful fines. Effective immediately, their authority over the neighborhood is nullified. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of victory settle over me. Daniel clapped me on the shoulder. "You did it, Carter," he said, grinning. "No," I replied, looking at the cheering neighbors. "We did it." For 3 decades, Margaret Green ruled the Bentwood HOA with an iron fist. But after the court's ruling, her power crumbled like sand slipping through her fingers. The HOA was officially dismantled. The judge's ruling prohibited the board from enforcing fines or imposing new regulations. All outstanding fines against the homeowners were nullified. It was over. But Margaret didn't go down quietly. The very next morning, I woke to the sound of car tires screeching outside my house. I walked onto my porch, coffee mug in hand, and saw Margaret storming toward my property. Her face was twisted with rage and humiliation, her eyes red-rimmed and wild. She jabbed a finger at me, her voice trembling. "You think you've won," she spat. "You think this is over?" I sipped my coffee calmly, my gaze steady. "I know I've won, Margaret," I replied coolly. "And yes, it's over." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You ruined everything. You destroyed my life," she shrieked. "No, Margaret," I said, my voice cold and even. "You did that yourself." The neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mr. Jennings walked up with a smirk, folding his arms across his chest. "Should we call the cops or let you keep making a fool of yourself?" he asked mockingly. Margaret's chest heaved with fury. "You're all going to regret this," she hissed. "No," Maria called out, stepping into the street, her arms crossed defiantly. "We regret nothing." The neighborhood erupted with cheers and applause, their voices drowning out Margaret's threats. Her face crumpled in disbelief. "You'll all pay for this," she screeched before storming to her car and speeding away. But she was wrong. The only one paying the price was Margaret Green. Over the next few weeks, life in Bentwood slowly returned to normal. Without the HOA's chokehold, the neighborhood transformed. The Wilkersons' toddler played happily in their backyard, splashing in their kiddie pool without fear of fines. Mr. Thompson, the elderly veteran, raised his flagpole proudly in front of his home. Maria planted her flower beds without worrying about with regulations. The neighborhood became a community again, no longer driven by fear, but by friendship and unity. One evening, as I was watering my lawn, Paul strolled over, beer in hand. "Got a second?" he asked, handing me the bottle. "Sure," I said, wiping sweat from my brow. He took a swig of his beer, glancing at the stone wall that now stood as a symbol of defiance. "You know," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips, "that wall you built? It kinda brought us all together." I chuckled. "Funny how that works, huh?" He nodded, his expression softening. We were all so used to fighting alone. I forgot what it felt like to stand together. I clinked my beer against his. "To freedom," I said. "To freedom," he echoed. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, Daniel called me, his voice brimming with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Try me?" He emailed me a link to a breaking news article. I clicked it, my eyes widening as I read the headline. "Former Bentwood HOA president under investigation for embezzlement and fraud." I skimmed the article, my heart pounding. Turns out, Margaret had been embezzling money from the HOA for years. The fines and fees she issued weren't just arbitrary punishments. They were her cash flow. She had been skimming money into a personal offshore account, siphoning thousands of dollars from homeowners. And it got worse. Records revealed that she had falsified documents to cover her tracks. She had even inflated repair costs for HOA projects, pocketing the difference. Daniel's voice was electric with triumph. "Margaret is facing criminal charges for embezzlement and wire fraud," he said with a satisfied chuckle. "Looks like she's finally getting what she deserves." I stared at the screen. shaking my head in disbelief. She thought she was untouchable. I muttered, "Not anymore," Daniel replied. Over the next few months, Bentwood transformed into a symbol of what a community could achieve when it stood united. Without the HOA's interference, neighbors collaborated and thrived. Mr. Thompson started a community garden, inviting everyone to contribute. The Wilkersons helped organize neighborhood barbecues. Paul and Maria created a community Facebook group to coordinate events and share resources. The stone wall I had built became a symbol of resistance. Children played in its shade. Neighbors decorated it with flowers and hand-painted tiles. It was no longer just a wall. It was a monument of freedom. One day, as I sat on my porch, Daniel joined me. He handed me an envelope with a mischievous grin. "What's this?" I asked. I opened it and blinked in surprise. It was a title deed. "Wait! This is from Margaret's old house?" I asked, confused. Daniel smirked. The Bentwood HOA property was seized after the lawsuit. We bought it. Well, the neighbors did. I stared at him in disbelief. "You're kidding me." "Nope." The neighbors pooled their money together, bought Margaret's house, and turned it into a neighborhood community center. It was poetic justice. Years later, the stone wall still stood tall, weathered by time but unyielding. Bentwood had become one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the region. Without the HOA, property values soared and the community thrived. On the 5th anniversary of the HOA's defeat, the neighborhood held a celebration at the community center. Neighbors shared stories, laughed, and raised their glasses. Maria found me by the barbecue, smiling warmly. "You did this, Carter," she said softly. "No." I corrected her, glancing at the faces of my friends and neighbors. "We did this." And as I stood there, watching the once-oppressed community laugh and thrive, I felt a deep sense of pride and peace. The stone wall stood behind us, a permanent reminder that sometimes, when you're pushed to the brink, you have to fight back with everything you have.